He asked to withdraw $5,000. They treated him like a criminal. What they didn't know, he owned the bank. What followed was the most polite takedown you'll ever witness, and a lesson the entire branch would never forget. Watch how one man turned quiet fury into absolute justice. Malcolm Dorsey sat motionless at the worn oak dining table in the cramped kitchen of his 27th floor apartment at Pinnacle Heights, right in the heart of downtown Detroit. Morning sunlight slipped through the plastic blinds, casting pale lines across a scattered stack of documents. Cold numbers, glaring red due dates, and legal forms that squeezed the breath from your chest. The wall clock ticked with unwavering rhythm, echoing the silence of a morning that promised nothing good. At 45, Malcolm should have been savoring the feeling of arrival, the kind of man whose presence made people close their laptops and sit up straight. But life doesn't follow a script. It doesn't care how many titles you carry or how hard you've worked. It just knows how to land the most unexpected punches, especially when your guard's down. He exhaled, eyes drifting over the fine print that felt like the sharp thorns of modern society. It wasn't that he didn't understand the paperwork. On the contrary, he knew the language of finance like a second tongue. But this morning, it felt heavier, more personal. Maybe it was because he had just closed a deal worth hundreds of millions, and yet the emptiness still lingered. Or maybe it was the words internal audit review that brought back memories of his father. Clarence Dorsey, a man who worked night shift at the East Haven steel mill until the day he was fired for daring to protest unsafe working conditions. "You gotta be 10 times better," his father once told him, calloused hands gripping Malcolm's shoulder like he was engraving the message into his bones. Not twice, 10 times, because there would always be someone who looked at him like he didn't belong. Malcolm carried those words like a sacred oath. He burned through nights and buried himself in books. From scholarship to internship, from early failure to the corner office. He climbed to the top, a place people said wasn't made for someone like him. But that morning, in the quiet kitchen under a haze of dusty light, he realized poverty never leaves you. It just goes dormant, waiting for the perfect moment to return, knocking with the tick of an old clock. He folded the documents, tucked them into a drawer, and stood up. The creaking hinges echoed like the sigh of the apartment itself. He threw on his worn brown leather jacket, the one that had followed him through years of broke student travels. It had faded with time, but to Malcolm, it was armor, his way of stepping out of a cloud of power and planting his feet back on the ground. Before leaving, he caught his reflection in the mirror, gray beginning to trace his temples, dark circles under his eyes from audit reports and merger meetings. He pulled a weather cap over his head, slid his wallet into the back pocket of his jeans, and left the apartment like any other man in Detroit. No bodyguard, no private driver, no second glances of respect. He called a rideshare to take him to Crestview Bank, Midtown Branch, a place that had drawn its share of complaints, aloof staff, sluggish service, and at times behavior that danced around the edge of discrimination, though no one ever dared call it by its name. Malcolm wasn't there to supervise. He was there to see, to hear, and to feel with his own eyes, things no internal report could ever capture. This wasn't the first time he'd gone undercover. Sometimes he dined at mom-and-pop restaurants funded by the bank. Other times, he'd sit quietly in community workshops as an anonymous attendee. It was the only way to truly understand how people lived, and who the system he ran was serving or hurting. The car pulled up at the corner. Malcolm stepped out, pulling his wallet from his pocket for one last check. Bank card, ID, everything in order. He stood for a moment, looking up at the building. The glass panel facade gleamed, reflecting the cold gray skies of early spring. But behind that modern exterior was something rotting. He drew a deep breath and pushed the door open. The entrance bell rang with a hollow chime. No one looked up, just a few steps. But for Malcolm Dorsey, it felt like a journey, one from the summit of power back to the place where he once began. A place where side glances, offhand comments, and casual indifference said more than any memo ever could. Inside the Crestview Bank, Midtown Branch, everything gleamed with artificial polish. Marble floors, beveled glass counters, sleek black leather chairs. But the air was cold. Cold enough to make Malcolm feel like he'd walked into a lab, not a place where people entrust their money and their faith. He moved slowly across the lobby, scanning the waiting area. An elderly Latina woman frowned at her watch. A young black man stood in the corner, quietly folded his loan application, and walked away shaking his head. Not a single employee greeted him. Not a single smile. Only the clack of keyboards and the faint, crackling voice of the overhead PA system. Malcolm approached window 3, where a white employee stood behind the counter. The name tag on his vest read, Cameron Doyle. The man, likely in his 30s, wore his gelled hair stiff and a thin, practiced smile that gleamed like cheap paint. Cameron looked up, and his gaze slid over Malcolm with a blatant once-over, like he'd just walked in wearing a torn hoodie and a crumpled paper bag instead of a leather jacket and a real wallet. "What do you need?" he asked curtly, his tone laced with impatient disinterest. Malcolm replied calmly, "I'd like to withdraw $5,000 from my personal account." Cameron blinked, raising a brow. "Do you have ID?" Without a word, Malcolm handed over his driver's license and bank card. Cameron took them and examined each detail as if he were scrutinizing the documents of a foreigner crossing the border. "Full name?" Cameron asked again, despite the name being printed clearly on both cards. "Malcolm Dorsey," he answered, keeping his gaze calm and steady. Cameron typed the name into the system at a pace, so painfully slow it felt like watching someone write a letter in Victorian cursive. 1 minute. 2. 3. Then he shrugged. "We're unable to process this transaction. This branch doesn't have enough cash on hand." Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "This is the central branch. $5,000 isn't exactly a large amount." "Even so," Cameron drawled, "for accounts like yours, we require additional verification. Policy." Malcolm felt his breath slow, the same way it did before stepping onto a battlefield he hadn't chosen, but knew all too well. He smiled faintly. "Policy? Or is it because of accounts like mine?" Cameron froze, just for a split second, but it was enough. Malcolm knew he hadn't imagined it. The game had begun, and this time he wasn't here to play nice. Cameron Doyle flipped the ID card back and forth like he was trying to spot a forgery under an imaginary magnifying glass, then finally sat down on the glass counter with a barely perceptible sneer. "You know," he said flatly, "sometimes we have to ensure that large withdrawals are from legitimate sources." Malcolm looked up, narrowing his eyes. "What exactly are you implying?" "Oh, nothing," Cameron said quickly, though the faint smugness in his tone remained. "It's just certain accounts, especially from certain customer groups, tend to warrant a bit more scrutiny. Anti-money laundering protocol, I'm sure you understand." Nearby, a few customers froze mid-motion. A middle-aged woman glanced sideways, lips parted, then quickly looked away, as if afraid to get involved. Malcolm pressed his lips together, fingers tapping lightly on the counter. "All I want is to withdraw $5,000 from my own account, with proper ID and credentials. Nothing suspicious here." "We're simply following procedure," Cameron replied, emphasizing each word like he was quoting from a non-existent handbook. "Some people just don't fit the standard profile, you understand." Malcolm leaned in slightly, his gaze suddenly sharp as steel. "People like me?" Cameron blinked, thrown off balance for a moment, but trying to hold his composure. "I didn't say that." "But that's exactly what you meant," Malcolm cut in, slowly and deliberately. "What were you going to say next? That someone like me can't be trusted? Or that just because I'm not wearing Armani's suit, I couldn't possibly have money in my account?" Cameron gave a nervous chuckle, glancing around the room for backup, but there was none. The other employees had their heads buried in their screens. The air in the bank lobby thickened, as if everyone could feel something cracking, quietly, painfully, beneath the surface. Malcolm crossed his arms, leaning forward just a bit. "Do you know who I am?" "A customer," Cameron answered quickly, his voice now tinged with unease. "And I'm being treated like a fraud. With your tone, your looks, and the way you said, 'people like me.'" Cameron opened his mouth as if to argue, but before a word could come out, Malcolm smiled, cool and knowing. "I'll let you process that transaction," he said calmly, "before people like me turn into HR's worst nightmare." He remained still, eyes locked onto Cameron Doyle like a finely tuned laser, built not to burn but to expose. No shouting, no slam fists. Malcolm had learned long ago that men like Cameron thrived on emotional outbursts. It gave them the excuse they wanted to nod and say, "See? That's exactly the kind of person he is." Not today. No one would get that satisfaction. But that didn't mean the anger wasn't real. It boiled just beneath the surface. Anger rooted deep. From when he was 7 and kicked out a toy store for not looking like a real customer. From 16, when his near-perfect scholarship application was shoved into the reconsider later pile. From the times he was followed in stores. From every sorry that seat's taken, when it clearly wasn't. Cameron Doyle knew none of that. To him, this was just another Tuesday morning. Just another man who didn't look the part trying to make a large withdrawal. But for Malcolm, this was a lifetime of having his identity questioned again and again, each time wearing a different voice. Sometimes polite, sometimes smug, always the same underneath. Suspicion. "You seem to misunderstand the situation," Malcolm said, voice smooth as small talk over coffee. "I'm not here asking for money. I'm here to withdraw my money. And if that unsettles you, maybe you're in the wrong business." Cameron forced a weak laugh. Try to mask his growing discomfort. "I'm just following protocol, in this line of work." "No, what I know," Malcolm cut in, "is that in this industry, there are people who wear professionalism like a mask to legitimize their bias. And trust me, I know more than you think." A nearby customer coughed. The air in the lobby seemed to pause, thick with tension. Malcolm glanced at the leather-strapped watch on his wrist. A birthday gift from his father, the same man who once told him, "You don't need to raise your voice to be heard. Say the right thing at the right moment, and the room will go silent." That moment was drawing near. Malcolm took a deep breath, forcing the rising fury back down into the cage of his chest like a beast in chains. But his eyes burned, not for the $5,000, but for 45 years of being met with looks like Cameron Doyle's. With slow, deliberate movement, Malcolm pulled his phone from the inside of his coat. No yelling, no scene, just a smooth swipe across the screen, as calmly as if he were placing a brunch order at an upscale cafe. Cameron crossed his arms, smirking. "Who you calling? Your lawyer?" he sneered, voice laced with mockery. "Or your mom?" Malcolm glanced at him, his smile razor-thin. "No, Cameron, I'm calling someone who can end your shift earlier than you planned." Cameron chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, please, go ahead. I'd love to see who you think you know." Malcolm raised the phone to his ear. "Connect me to Peter Langston. Internal line. Urgent." The words rang out, crisp and clear in the now silent bank lobby. A few customers turned to look. An older man paused mid-signature, looking up with interest. Cameron's brows furrowed. "Langston? The regional director?" His voice faltered, the confidence slipping. 3 rings. Then silence. Malcolm straightened his posture. "Peter, Malcolm Dorsey here. I'm at the Midtown branch. There's something you need to see, and you better come in person." "I'll wait." He ended the call, slid the phone back into his coat pocket, and turned to Cameron, his expression calm, controlled, and commanding, like a general who had just given the order to fire. "Do you still need to verify my account?" Malcolm asked, each word deliberate, sharp. Cameron stammered, I was just following procedure." "Procedure?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Or instinct?" He leaned in just enough for his voice to cut clean. "Seems to me you're not very good at telling the difference between a customer and a threat." A young customer nearby let out a low laugh. "Yo, who is this guy? He just called the top boss down here like it's nothing." "Sure," a woman whispered. "Word is, he's the one who founded this whole bank." Sweat began to seep through Cameron's perfectly pressed shirt. Every word he had uttered earlier now felt like stones, hitting reinforced glass. And the glass was starting to crack. Malcolm stood silently, not because he needed anyone to save him, but because the system needed to watch itself in the mirror. And the moment Peter Langston walked through those doors, that reflection would be unavoidable. Exactly 13 minutes after call, the automatic doors slid open again, A man in a sharp navy suit and thin striped tie strode into the lobby, face drawn tight with tension. A gleaming nameplate on his lapel read, Peter Langston, Regional Director. Peter scanned the room like he was looking for a fire. When his eyes landed on Malcolm, he froze, as if rooted to the spot. Then, in a moment so heavy it silenced the entire lobby, he moved quickly toward Malcolm and spoke. Mr. Dorsey, I wasn't aware you'd be visiting today. The words hit Cameron Doyle like a slap. He took a step back, eyes darting between Peter and Malcolm like a man trying to escape a storm he had summoned himself. What did you just call him? A young man near the chairs asked, blinking in disbelief. Mr. Dorsey, Peter repeated, his voice instinctively dropping into a respectful tone. The chief executive officer of the entire Crestview system. The name echoed like a thunderclap through the lobby, shattering the haze of indifference that hung in the air. A female employee at the service desk froze mid-keystroke. The security guard near the entrance stepped back, face paling as if he'd just recalled something terrible he'd witnessed. Malcolm remained composed, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment all along. Peter, he said, his voice low but firm, it seems this branch's staff could use a refresher course on customer service. An unconscious bias, or perhaps very conscious bias. I couldn't agree more, Peter replied, swallowing audibly. I'll handle this matter personally. Cameron in my office. Now. I didn't mean... I was just following protocol. Cameron stammered, like a glitched-out machine grasping for an excuse. Policy doesn't cover discrimination. Peter cut him off sharply, not even glancing back. And it certainly doesn't cover arrogant ignorance. Inside. Now. Cameron froze, his face drained of color. He shuffled away like a man walking to sentencing, each step scraping the floor in quiet shame. Malcolm turned to Peter, eyes sharp as a blade. We're going to have a longer conversation, Peter. But first, I'm still waiting on my withdrawal. Of course, sir. Peter nodded, offering a slight bow. The $5,000 will be handled immediately. The lobby remained suspended in stunned silence. Someone murmured, I think we just witnessed the cleanest checkmate of the year. And Malcolm Dorsey? He simply stood there, composed and still, like a king who had just removed his mask in the town square, only for the crowd to realize they had underestimated the man who wrote the rules of the game. A newly assigned teller, sent by Peter, handed Malcolm the stack of $5,000 in cash. Malcolm took it calmly and began to count each bill slowly, not to verify the amount, but to let the silence settle like smoke. Each crisp rustle of paper sounded like a gavel striking the floor of Midtown's pride. Thank you, he said, sliding the bills into his leather wallet. Now for the more interesting part. Peter swallowed hard. I suppose you mean the employee handbook and complaint files? Exactly, Malcolm replied with a nod. I want to know if what's happening here is an accident or a pattern. Peter nodded rapidly, like a misaligned spring. Why, yes, I'll have someone bring them out right away. No, Malcolm said, folding his arms. You bring them. Personally. There was a slight pause. Then Peter turned on his heel and walked off like a man yanked by an invisible string. Meanwhile, a young female employee, likely new, leaned toward a co-worker and whispered, If I were Cameron, I'd be digging a hole to crawl into right now. Then Malcolm turned to another employee hiding awkwardly near the ATM column. You, bring me Cameron Doyle's personnel file. Immediately. The employee jolted, then hurried off in a clumsy rush. Less than 5 minutes later, Peter returned carrying a thick employee manual and a stack of internal files. Malcolm took them, flipping quickly through the pages until his finger landed squarely on the section titled, Equity in Customer Service. He held the folder up before the crowd. This, he said, voice steady and firm, is Crestview Bank's policy manual. But policies mean nothing if the people enforcing them are already broken on the inside. A round of applause burst from the back of the lobby. A black customer clapped first, then others followed, one by one, like a domino wave sweeping to the cold marble room. Malcolm nodded in gratitude, then turned to Peter. Cameron Doyle is terminated. effective immediately. No negotiations. No reputation-saving spin. Peter's face went pale. I'll make the announcement and retrieve his ID badge right away. And you, Malcolm continued, will initiate a full audit of this branch. Staff, procedures, complaints, everything. I want the first report on my desk within 48 hours. Yes, sir. Peter bowed his head. Malcolm inhaled deeply, his eyes sweeping across the lobby like a stage director adjusting the spotlight before the final scene. Because sometimes, he said, the only way to fix a rotting house is to start by clearing it out from within. As Peter Langston disappeared into the hallway, clutching a stack of documents, and Cameron Doyle was gently escorted away from the counter by security, head bowed in disgrace, the air inside Crestview Bank's Midtown branch remained thick with unspoken tension. Malcolm Dorsey stood quietly for a moment, his gaze settling on every face around him. Older customers, young professionals, white, black, latinx, women with guarded expressions, men with arms now unfolded as if releasing years of quiet defense. He stepped to the center of the lobby, voice carrying with precision. Some of you may be wondering why I made such a big deal out of a simple failed withdrawal. A few soft nods responded. An elderly woman near the teller counter looked up, still holding her unprinted receipt. But the truth is, Malcolm continued, this was never just about the money. It's about how we're seen, how we're judged based on first impressions, on the color of our skin, on the way we walk, on the way we speak. He paused, letting the words settle, into the room, into the eyes meeting his, into the history so many carried silently. I used to be the little boy standing in line at a bank with my mother, Malcolm said, voice unwavering, watching her get denied a checking account because she didn't have a trustworthy address. I watched my father be turned down for a business loan to open his own auto shop, while the man right after him, a white man, same paperwork, was invited to sit down, offered coffee. No one spoke. Every ear in the lobby was tuned to his voice. And today, I run this entire banking system. Yet I'm still met with suspicion, still seen as a threat, just because I wasn't wearing a designer suit, just because I walked in unannounced. He took a deep breath. If that can still happen to me, I can't imagine how many times it's happened to you. And I promise you now, it ends here. A ripple of applause followed, not loud but sincere. A middle-aged woman stood up, her eyes glistening. Thank you, she said softly. Not everyone in your position turns back to lift those behind. Malcolm gave her a quiet nod, because I never forgot where I came from. He stepped back, eyes sweeping once more across the Crestview Midtown lobby. Behind the counters, employees still held their breath. Some had their heads bowed. Others were subtly adjusting their name tags, as if that alone could make them invisible. He nodded slightly, as if to say, that's all. But before leaving, he paused, turned around and spoke again, his voice low, but each word struck like a hammer to stone. I hope today is not forgotten. Silence. If I have to return to something like this again, if I receive one more report of discrimination, favoritism, or a customer being disrespected for anything other than who they truly are, then believe me, there will be no second warnings. Peter Langston swallowed hard, his grip tightening around the file. One employee behind the counter gave a subtle nod, as if making a silent vow. Cameron Doyle was long gone, but the shadow he left still lingered in the weight of everyone's gaze. This bank, Malcolm said, isn't just a place where we hold money. It's where we hold trust. And from this day forward, I want every single person who works here to understand. You either help build that trust or you will be replaced. Silence. Then, an eruption of applause. Louder, stronger, as if the entire room had finally found its escape from a silence that had lingered for far too long. Malcolm didn't stay for handshakes or belated apologies. He simply turned away and walked toward the glass doors, like a man who had just finished a task no one had seen, but everyone had felt. The automatic doors slid open. He stepped outside. The March wind caught the edge of his worn leather coat, and the silver in his temples shifted gently with the rhythm of the city. The bank branch still stood, pristine and polished, with not a single crack in its glass walls, but everyone inside knew a fracture had run deep into its core. And from that morning on, No one at the Midtown branch ever dared to judge a customer by their appearance again.